Another phase, especially under President Trump with his focus on the homeland, where the National Guard and Reserves become a critical component of how we secure that homeland and apply those civilian sets across the spectrum.
Hegseth said deployment of National Guard and Marines is aimed at protecting ICE agents. But when he was asked about the cost of moving in the National Guard and Marine Corps, he exercised his right to remain silent. Hegseth's grilling before the House committee comes after U.S. President Donald Trump said Los Angeles would have burned to the ground if he did not act. On the state front, California Governor Gavin Newsom is taking on Donald Trump. Newsom accused Trump of authoritarianism. The political battle from Washington to California comes after President Trump doubled down on troops deployment as soon as the protests escalated. Trump ordered 2,000 more National Guards to be deployed in LA. Along with this, he has also called in 700 Marine personnel, often referred to as U.S. elite fighting force. Earlier today, protesters and police came face to face in Santa Ana area of southeast of LA, where sounds of flashbangs and firecrackers were heard. Security forces dispersed protesters using rubber bullets and armored vehicles in downtown LA. These demonstrators had gathered outside a federal detention center in downtown where immigrants had been held. Immigration crackdown and following protests that began in LA first spread within the state of California to San Francisco and capital Sacramento. But now they're being reported from California to New York. In Texas, protests were reported in Dallas, Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. People also took to the streets in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. These are the visuals from Texas, where protests were reported in two major cities of Dallas and Austin. Multiple people were detained after a street showdown with police officers. California Governor Gavin Newsom came down heavily on President Trump. Newsom slammed the move as deranged and un-American. In a social media post, Newsom wrote, U.S. Marines should not be deployed on American soil facing their own countrymen to fulfill the rearranged fantasy of a dictatorial president. This is the first time since 1965 that U.S. President has sent National Guard troops to a U.S. city without a governor's approval. And the move has sparked a political tug of war between Democrats and Republicans. All right, let's head to Washington, D.C. We do understand that U.S. President Donald Trump is currently addressing the press on the situation in L.A. Let's just listen in.
Maybe be out there. I don't know, but Christy, could you speak to that?
Absolutely. So in 2020, I was a governor of a neighboring state to Tim Walz and watched him let his city burn. And the president and I have talked about this in the past, and he was not going to let that happen to another city and to another community where a bad governor made a bad decision. So Claudia Sheinbaum came out and encouraged more protests in LA, and I condemn her for that. She should not be encouraging violent protests that are going on. If people are allowed to peacefully protest, but the violence that we're seeing is not acceptable, and it's not going to happen in America. This president is standing up for the average American who wants to walk their child to school every day safely, run their small business, and provide for their families. That's the action that he's taken. He has every authority under the Constitution to send these National Guard under Title X into these communities and make sure that operations go smoothly, that law enforcement officers are protected, that they can continue to do their work without fear of being injured or killed or disrespected, and that they can go home to their families at night. So I'm incredibly proud of the president for activating the National Guard and for sending in these Marines, because these Marines are specifically trained to meet the need that we have on the ground in LA right now. And Governor Newsom has done a disservice to the state of California for many years. The people there should never elect him into a leadership position ever again. He
The
clearly
governor's a
cannot.
nice guy, but he's grossly incompetent.
Terrible
When it comes
guy.
to his railroad that he's building, where it's like 30 times over budget, nobody's ever seen anything like it. Now it doesn't even go to San Francisco and LA. It's way short of it. After years of work and overruns like nobody's, those contractors are some of the wealthiest people in the world, I guarantee you that, because that money goes to those contractors. They just did a number on the wallet of the people of California. That train, you should look at that train. That is the greatest. I've never seen cost overruns. I've seen cost overruns and great incompetence over my life. I've never seen anything like that.
Mr. President, these protests obviously started in reaction to these large-scale ICE operations in Los Angeles. Should people expect to see similar operations in the rest of the country?
Yeah.
And would similar protests see similar response?
As you know, we're moving murderers out of our country that were put here by Biden or the auto pen. The auto pen really did. I mean, the people, whether it's Lisa Monaco or whoever operated the auto pen, these are criminals. The people are criminals that allowed these criminals into our country. And I don't think that Biden knew what the hell he was doing. I don't think he even knew about it. But when they opened up our borders for the whole world to come in, yeah, we're going to get them out. We're getting them out. We're starting to get acknowledgement from the courts that, you know, there's a system. They come in without courts and they go out there. They want trials and everything else. I think that's starting to work out now. Judges are starting to see what a terrible situation it is. Many of those people that you saw on television last night are criminals that were allowed into our country by Biden, and they want to stay, and we don't want them. And they come from jails, and they come from mental institutions, and they come from all over the world, not just South America. And we're not going to let them stay. And this is the first, perhaps, of many, or perhaps, you know, if we didn't attack this one very strongly, you'd have them all over the country. But I can inform the rest of the country that when they do it, if they do it, they're going to be met with equal or greater force than we met right here. We did a great job. The people, you, Christy, and Tom Holman, and all of the people, Pete Hegseth, all of the people involved did an amazing job. We stopped a disaster. And it looks like a planned disaster, not just, this didn't just happen. They had weapons, they had tools, they had everything you needed. I mean, they were throwing iced water in bottles, in glass bottles, at officers and at soldiers. These are, you could not use the word insurrection, but you could also use the word, these are very dangerous people, they're bad people. They were met with heavy force and they folded. And they may be there a little bit tonight, they may be there a little bit, but it seems to be getting less and less because they're going there and they're met with a very heavy force. And if they weren't, you would have that city right now would be on fire. It would be burning down. The rest of it, what's left over, because the other fire was started because they wouldn't allow water into LA. They wouldn't allow water into California because they had it all shifted out to the Pacific Ocean. And I turned it around. And I told them to do it in my first term, and they didn't do it. We had COVID, and they didn't do it. And I told them to do it. We did it in the second. Now we have billions of gallons of water flowing down. But Newsom should have done this. He's an incompetent man and an incompetent governor. Okay, any other questions?
Mr. President, do you have any message to adversaries as the Army kicks off 250-year birthday celebration?
I just think it's amazing. We're going to have a fantastic June 14th parade, Flag Day. It's going to be an amazing day. We have tanks, we have planes, we have all sorts of things. And I think it's going to be great. We're going to celebrate our country for a change. You know, recently, as you know, with World War II, the victory of World War II, I called up France and they were celebrating the victory. Well, we helped them a lot, as you know. I don't have to get into that. But I called up other countries. They're all celebrating the victory. We're the only country that didn't celebrate the victory. And we're the one that won the war. Okay, if it wasn't for us, that war, you would be speaking German right now, okay? We won the war, and you might be speaking Japanese too. I mean, you might be speaking a combination of both. We won the war, and we're the only country that didn't celebrate it. And we're going to be celebrating big on Saturday. We're going to have a lot of, and if there's any protester that wants to come out, they will be met with very big force. By the way, for those people that want to protest, they're going to be met with very big force. And I haven't even heard about a protest, but, you know, this is people that hate our country, but they will be met with very heavy force.
Mr. President, one last
Thank you
question
very
from
much,
California.
everybody.
Thank you, press.
Thank you.
Thank you, press. Let's move out. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, guys.
you.
All right, so that is live at the White House. And what you just saw there is Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem backing U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to send in the National Guard and the Marine, saying that if he did not do that, then LA could have burned to the ground. And the president says that these measures will be taken to other states if at all the residents in those states decide to riot or face the police. He actually went hard on Governor Gavin Newsom, saying that he's done a very bad job, and he thanked his secretaries for doing a good job by sending in the National Guard and the Marine. This is live at the White House, Washington, D.C.
Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has claimed that the country's second biggest city, Los Angeles, is being invaded by a foreign enemy.
And this was during an address to U.S. troops at Fort Bragg on the Army's 250th anniversary. The U.S. president vowed to liberate the city after days of protests sparked by immigration raids.
Under the Trump administration, this anarchy will not stand. We will not allow federal agents to be attacked, and we will not allow an American city to be invaded and conquered by a foreign enemy. And that's what they are.
Trump has deployed thousands of troops, including 700 active duty U.S. Marines, to Los Angeles, despite California authorities saying this move is unnecessary and will inflame the situation further.
Speaking at one of the country's biggest army bases, Trump described protesters as animals and got troops to boo the names of California Governor Gavin Newsom and ex-President Joe Biden. Trump also claimed that Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass paid troublemakers, agitators and insurrectionists.
In Los Angeles, the governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, they're incompetent, and they paid troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists. They're engaged in this willful attempt to nullify federal law and aid the occupation of the city by criminal invaders.
For more on this, we're now joined by Stephen Golub, political analyst and lawyer. He is widely recognized international development consultant and scholar with more than 30 years of experience in over 40 countries across the globe. Thank you so much for joining us on World DNA. Always a pleasure to have you.
Good to be here.
Now, in your view, does the deployment of military forces to manage protests risk normalizing the use of armed forces to handle domestic dissent? What might this mean for future protest movements as well?
Great question. And yes, this is very dangerous. It's unprecedented for a president to call in the National Guard and especially the Marines, the U.S. Armed Forces, in this manner under these kinds of circumstances. And really bear in mind the big picture here is that this is not wholly or even mainly about immigration. That is what President Trump is doing. It's not mainly about immigration. It's about opening up the doors to suppress dissent, to suppress protests, to suppress opposition in all sorts of ways down the line. In your excellent introduction, you really do give a taste of that. He's talking about calling opponents insurrectionists, in effect calling them traitors. He's saying that there's an invasion by these people who are immigrants here. Whether or not you consider them here to be illegal, they're not invaders in any sense in which the Constitution or any of our laws would justify military use for defense on domestic ground. So it's a very, very dangerous thing he's doing. He's doing it intentionally. It's part of his playbook. And while we can have legitimate debates about immigration policy, the really big thing that's going on here is President Trump's attempt to suppress opposition, really.
Mr. Golub, the terms that he's used, foreign enemy, agitators, insurrectionists, it's almost seeming, it at least gives the sense that it justifies the calling of the National Guard and elite forces. At this point, do you feel, and critics are arguing that this could be a political maneuver rather than a security necessity. What are your views on that front?
Oh, it's very much a political maneuver. Look, Los Angeles is not a little town. It has 9,000 police officers. The governor of California and the mayor of Los Angeles could call in thousands of more officers from state forces and from other local forces. So they could handle these protests of hundreds, or even if there were thousands of people involved, pretty easily if left to their own devices, which is what other presidents have done when we've had protests about all sorts of issues in the past. But this is not what President Trump wants. He wants to exacerbate the situation. And let's also bear in mind a real irony here, a very sad, tragic irony. On January 6, 2021, President Trump spent over 3 hours just watching on television as commander-in-chief when more than 1,000 people sacked the U.S. Capitol, many of them doing so violently, injuring 150 police officers, resulting in the deaths of several police officers over the following days. And he did nothing about that. He then went ahead, after these people had been convicted of crimes in their raid on the Capitol, and pardoned them, calling them patriots and heroes. What kind of contrast is that? What kind of sad, dangerous contrast is that with his overreacting intentionally to these legitimate protests in Los Angeles by calling in the National Guard and the U.S. Marines in an unprecedented and very, very arguably illegal manner?
Mr. Golub, I just want to take a little forward view here with your perspective. It's been 5 days already. We're only seeing the tensions rise. We're seeing more troops being called in, and there are now talks of troops also being deployed in other cities. If this continues in this manner, if we just focus on California, what's the game plan going forward? Is it just to suppress the protests, or is there a further change in administration also perhaps on the cards?
In fact, Shrivan, if I could just add to that, yes. I would also like to discuss the legality of this. What are the constitutional limits that may be in place, especially without the governor's consent in calling in the National Guard? So just to understand that as well.
Okay, on the legality first, it's very arguably illegal what he's doing, that he doesn't have the authority to do this. You really have to have extraordinary circumstances, such as an invasion, and this is not an invasion in any common sense use of the term. The fact that you have people who are in the country illegally, almost all of them working peacefully, contributing to the economy. We could have a debate about whether they should be deported or not, but they're not invading the country. Another case would be if they're endangering national security or if they're insurrectionists. That's the language that he's using. But they're not endangering national security. They're not insurrectionists. The protesters are not insurrectionists. So really, it's a very thin or non-existent ground that he's basing all these actions on, especially calling in the U.S. Marines. The National Guard is bad enough, but almost always the National Guard is simply called in by the governor of a given state. For your information, they're usually part-time soldiers who just train on weekends and are deployed in crises or if there's a natural disaster. So there's really no legal basis for it. Going forward in California, I think he wants the situation to get worse, and it may get worse before it gets better, and this crackdown could spread to other states, and as I've emphasized, it could be used for other reasons, including trying to disrupt our congressional elections next year, which may be a real target or really part of his strategy to pave the way for using military force to take over state government functions or to disrupt protests or to suppress dissent in other ways.
The voices of critics have definitely become louder as the days progress, and we see more and more protesters coming to the streets and more forces coming in from both sides. Tensions only seem to be rising in Los Angeles along with other cities. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Stephen Golub. Always a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, another global news. In an address to U.S. troops at Fort Bragg on Army's 250th anniversary, Trump also claimed that L.A. is being invaded by a foreign enemy. That's the claim made by the U.S. president. Trump further vowed to liberate the city after days of demonstrations sparked by immigration raids. Take a listen.
Under the Trump administration, this anarchy will not stand. We will not allow federal agents to be attacked, and we will not allow an American city to be invaded and conquered by a foreign enemy, and that's what they are.
Trump has deployed thousands of troops, including 700 active duty U.S. Marines to L.A., despite California authorities saying the move is unnecessary and will only inflame the situation. Speaking at one of the country's biggest army bases, Trump described demonstrators as animals and got troops to boo the names of California Governor Gavin Newsom and the former president of the U.S., Joe Biden. Trump also claimed that Newsom and L.A. Mayor Karen Bass paid troublemakers, agitators and insurrectionists.
In Los Angeles, the governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, they're incompetent, and they paid troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists. They're engaged in this willful attempt to nullify federal law and aid the occupation of the city by criminal invaders.
Trump's remark came as police and demonstrators continue to face off in L.A., the city's fifth day of demonstrations against deportation actions. Trump has vowed to keep the military inside L.A. until there's peace on the streets. Dozens of demonstrators thronged the streets despite the imposition of a curfew for parts of the city's downtown area. Mayor Karen Bass said that the curfew imposed in 1 square mile area to stop the vandalism, to stop the looting. Mounted riot police in LA chased demonstrators. At least 67 people were arrested by California Highway Patrol after demonstrators entered the US 101 freeway. Immigration crackdown and following demonstrations that began in LA have spread across the country. It first spread within the state of California to San Francisco and capital Sacramento. In Texas, demonstrations were reported in Dallas, Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. People also took to the street in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. In Texas, multiple people were detained in 2 major cities of Dallas and Austin after a street showdown with police officers. Demonstrators also scuffled with police on the streets of Chicago, while a march took place in New York against immigration raids. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was grilled by U.S. House Appropriations Committee on the cost of deployment of troops in L.A. He made it absolutely clear that deployment of troops for homeland security will expand under U.S. President Donald Trump.
I think we're entering an even another phase, especially under President Trump, with his focus on the homeland, where the National Guard and Reserves become a critical component of how we secure that homeland and apply those civilian sets across the spectrum.
The unrest in California completes 1 full week on Thursday. But with each passing day, the Trump administration is deploying more and more troops in the western state. And the city of Los Angeles has now become a flashpoint. California state administration is now fighting this battle against Donald Trump in court. The state of California has filed a lawsuit against what the administration calls an unlawful use of power by the U.S. president. California Governor Gavin Newsom asked a federal judge to block the Trump administration's deployment of National Guard members and Marines to L.A. In the lawsuit, California administration argues that Trump's federal actions promote civil unrest. The lawsuit against Trump also has one key argument. The case says that Trump administration violated the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which details the limits of the federal power.
Donald Trump, without consulting California law enforcement leaders, commandeered 2,000 of our state's National Guard members to deploy on our streets, illegally and for no reason. This brazen abuse of power by a sitting president inflamed a combustible situation, putting our people, our officers, and even our National Guard at risk.
A federal judge has ordered the U.S. president and co-defendants to file a response in the lawsuit. The deadline is just within a few hours, and Trump has already said that the ordered troop deployment under Title 10 of the U.S. Code. Title 10 has a provision which allows the U.S. president to deploy National Guard units into federal service under 3 circumstances. That's number 1, if the U.S. is invaded. Number 2, if there is a rebellion or danger of rebellion. Or if the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Even now, at the moment, there is heavy troop deployment in California. So far, at least, the police have arrested 25 people for violating the curfew. Law enforcement officers confronted demonstrators outside the federal building as demonstrations intensified. On Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth faced a rally of questions and criticism from Democrat lawmakers on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. Hegseth said that the deployment was to protect ICE agents, and he refused to divulge the cost of the expansive troop deployment in LA.
ICE agents should be allowed to be safe in doing their operations, and we have deployed National Guard and the Marines to protect them in the execution of their duties, because we ought to be able to enforce immigration law in this country.
The use of the active duty forces raises questions on how this unprecedented situation will be navigated. The U.S. Marines are highly trained in combat and crisis response, but their experience and expertise lies in global conflict zones and not a chaotic domestic protest. According to reports on Tuesday, the Pentagon was working on a memo to issue guidelines for the Marines who have been deployed in these demonstrations. But pressure is building on the Defense Department, especially on Pete Hegseth. California senators have reportedly written to the Pentagon demanding an explanation on the legal basis for deploying active duty Marines in Los Angeles. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Johanna LeBlanc, political analyst, national security law analyst and foreign relations expert. And she's joining us live on the broadcast from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Race to Power, Ms. LeBlanc. First up, of course, does the Trump administration have the legal basis for deploying active Marine troops to quell the demonstrations after Trump deployed National Guards? And the deployment at the demonstration site that we are seeing is more than what the U.S. has deployed in Iraq and Syria.
Well, if the United States government, in this case, the President of the United States, deemed that there's an insurrectionist in the state of California, then by law, the President could deploy federal troops on the ground to address the crisis without the consent of the governor or without the request of the governor.
Right, Ms. LeBlanc, the California administration has now filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. I want to seek your assessment. How do you think is the U.S. justice system looking at this, and what are legal experts saying?
Well, I think that the President of the United States will have to show that there is indeed an insurrection happening in the United States, that there is an invasion of folks from different countries. And in this case, Mr. Trump has always said that the number of illegal, undocumented immigrants that we have here in this country and the number of folks who have entered through the U.S.-Mexico border, it qualifies as an invasion of our country. So I think it's a matter of how the Department of Justice litigate this. And then ultimately, I think Mr. Trump is willing to take this all the way to the Supreme Court because there are a number of protests that are scheduled to take place across America. And I think Mr. Trump wants to be in a position where he will be able to deploy national troops, if needed, across America in order to send a very strong message. Listen, the federal government is not playing here. We want law and order, and we want those folks deported by any means necessary.
But Mr. Blank, you do speak of how that is Trump's broader agenda of deploying troops across the country. Do you think that there's a broader strategy in play with Trump deploying active troops at the protest site?
I think there is certainly a broader strategy at play. One of the strategy is that we know Mr. Trump ran a campaign on immigration, that he was going to deport as many undocumented or illegal immigrants as possible. And secondly, when it's time for election, again, by the time the midterms come around, Mr. Trump wants to be able to say that he has delivered to the American people. But I think that there are more productive ways for Mr. Trump to do this. I think some of the images that we're seeing does not represent Mr. Trump's administration quite well. One of the things I think Mr. Trump could have done is that it costs roughly $14,000 to deport one undocumented person. I think that right now the administration is offering $1,000 for self-deportation. They could increase that to maybe $9,000 and $10,000 for folks to self-deport. I think you'll see more and more people wanting to deport versus the United States having to find them and deport them, which costs the U.S. taxpayers a whole lot more money.
All right, Mr. Blank, thank you so much for joining us here on Race to Power.
Thank you.
And we begin the bulletin by bringing you some live images from the United States that you see on your screens. There is a major protest taking place in San Antonio, in the city of Texas. Now, hundreds have gathered in the city's central area to protest against anti-immigration crackdown across the state and the country. Now, these are the live images from Los Alamitos now there, where the crowd is continuing to grow in size. People are standing there in protest and chanting near City Hall. Now, security forces have been deployed as well. Many joined in the peaceful demonstrations. The protesters were led by a drummer and continued chanting in Spanish, saying, "We are here and aren't leaving." The protest in San Antonio comes a day after the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, ordered the state's National Guard to deploy to the city of San Antonio. The order in the view of immigration-led protests planned for this week, saying the soldiers are on standby. The protests against the Trump administration's immigration policies have been reported across major cities in Texas. Now, on Monday night, protesters had blocked traffic and faced off against officers. Now, Abbott's move to mobilize troops follows Donald Trump's decision to send the California National Guard to Los Angeles after some limited and mostly peaceful protests against immigration raids. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a limited night curfew was in effect in several parts of downtown Los Angeles. The curfew was imposed after several nights of violent protests, arson, and looting. About 700 Marines and over 2,000 National Guards are still undergoing civil disturbance training at Naval Weapons Station Seal Beach in Orange County. Sherman. Now, the Marines might join the 2,000 or so Guard. It has been speculated that these troops may join and be deployed in downtown areas to protect federal buildings during sometimes violent demonstrations against President Trump's immigration crackdown. Now, Sherman, the commander of Task Force 51, which is overseeing the more than 4,000 Guard troops and 700 Marines who have been deployed to Los Angeles to provide security during the protests, has said so.
The United States' second largest city is swept by a wave of mass arrests as protests against President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown entered the sixth day. Los Angeles authorities have lifted the curfew, which it said was meant to stop looting and vandalism in the city. Police have arrested at least 25 people for violating the curfew. There is heavy troop presence in California. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth says the troop deployment is about maintaining law and order amid immigration crackdown. Heavily armed security officers, including several riding horses, patrolled near government buildings. 700 U.S. Marines are on standby, ready to step foot in L.A. Another 2,000 National Guard troops are headed to the city. The heavy military movement took place 48 hours after Trump directed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to mobilize the battalion. Law enforcement officers confronted demonstrators outside the federal building as protests, riot police on horses and foot surrounded a group of a few hundred that had gathered in that area. An Australian Broadcasting Corporation cameraman was hit in the chest by a less lethal round while filming the Los Angeles protests. President Trump pledged to liberate Los Angeles from what he claims is an invasion by a foreign enemy. California's leaders who disapproved Trump's decision moved the courts, seeking to prevent the Republican from sending thousands of troops onto the streets. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who claims the presence of troops exacerbates tensions, has asked a judge for an emergency injunction regarding the troop deployment, arguing it is unlawful as well as excessive and unnecessary.
Pulling a military dragnet all across Los Angeles, well beyond his stated intent to just go after violent and serious criminals. His agents are arresting dishwashers, gardeners, day laborers, and seamstresses. That's just weakness masquerading as strength. Donald Trump's government isn't protecting our communities. They're traumatizing our communities. And that seems to be the entire point.
Demonstrations have quickly spread to other cities nationwide, including Dallas, Austin, Texas, Chicago, and New York. In the Atlanta suburb of Brookhaven, dozens of demonstrators waved American and Mexican flags and held signs against U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. In Texas, where police in Austin used chemical irritants to disperse several hundred demonstrators, National Guard troops have been put on standby in areas where demonstrations were planned. The U.S. president is mulling the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act, which authorizes the president to deploy military forces inside the U.S. to suppress rebellion or domestic violence or to enforce the law in certain situations. It's one of the most extreme emergency powers available to a U.S. sitting president.
On the 6th of June 2025, protests broke out when federal agents combed through a garment district in Los Angeles. They searched for undocumented immigrants. This was part of the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration, focusing on raiding workplaces. Protesters threw eggs as law enforcement officers unleashed pepper spray and rubber bullets. After 2 days of protests by hundreds of demonstrators against the immigration raids, U.S. President Donald Trump deployed National Guard troops to California, saying the protests interfered with federal law enforcement. He termed them a form of rebellion against the U.S. authority. More than 2,000 troops were sent in to quell protests. California Governor Gavin Newsom hit out at President Trump's move and announced that his office would take legal action against the president. Donald Trump is putting fuel on this fire. Commandeering a state's National Guard without consulting the governor of that state is illegal and immoral. California will be taking him to court. He further accused Trump of manufacturing the crisis. Trump hit back and said that he did speak to Newsom to control the situation on the 7th of June and provided a screenshot to an American media house. Several cities across the United States joined Los Angeles in protesting against the anti-immigration crackdown.
We don't have kids. You know, the police tell you nothing about your local 888.
As the protests grew in LA, about 700 Marines were also brought in. They assembled in a staging area in the Seal Beach, about 50 kilometers south of the city, awaiting deployment to specific locations. So why does Trump want to crack down on immigration? Is Trump permitted to send troops to stop the Los Angeles protests? Where are the largest immigrant communities in the U.S.? How much do immigrants contribute to the U.S. economy? Do immigrants increase crime in the U.S.? All this and more on this week's WION Wide Angle. On the 8th of June, protesters gathered in downtown Los Angeles as well as nearby cities. This was in response to a series of deportation raids in areas of the city with large immigrant populations. Dozens of people were arrested in Los Angeles after days of violent protests. The clash came after agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and other federal law enforcement agencies raided several locations in Southern California, which sparked mass protests.
We're here protesting for our families that are being separated in our neighborhoods, and we want justice.
Now they know that they cannot go anywhere in this country where our people are and try to kidnap our workers, our people. For every single minute that we were here resisting against the Border Patrol, that was time that they were not out deporting people in our community. They could not kidnap people in our community today because the people came out to resist.
Beautiful to see everybody come out together and stand against it, and I think we need to continue doing that.
Look at this eyewitness footage from LA. It shows what appears to be an immigration enforcement operation at a business involving unmarked vans and armed personnel in military-style uniforms. A handcuffed man is led to an unmarked van during one such raid. Dozens of people across the city are reported to have been taken into custody during federal immigration raids.
We are federal law enforcement officers executing a lawful criminal search warrant. It was signed and approved by a federal judge. We are repeating our duties as federal law enforcement officers and preventing us from carrying out our official and lawful duty. If we do not disperse immediately, you're arrested and charged with a crime.
Washington vowed to continue the raids despite opposition from local communities and officials. U.S. President Donald Trump deployed more than 2,000 National Guard troops to the city, triggering a political row. He also condemned what he called violent insurrectionist mobs. Demonstrators took to the streets in Los Angeles calling for the withdrawal of National Guard troops, arguing their arrival would only escalate tensions. In downtown Los Angeles, protesters faced off with National Guard soldiers in front of a detention center, where the detained immigrants were knocking on windows. Tensions rose as police officers used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd, leading to several arrests.
The LAPD moving in on horseback, firing rubber bullets at protesters, moving them on through the heart of LA.
You just shot the. You okay?
Y'all told us to come here for opportunity. We came, and then now it's like, oh, you have to leave. But when I was the working class, y'all loved me, right? But now that we're too many people, what's the issue?
It's a fight for our community. LA wouldn't be what it is without us. There was no need for it. I'm a victim of the fires in Altadena, and they didn't help at all. They didn't even let us go back to our home.
The protests began after it emerged that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, officers were carrying out raids in areas of the city with prominent Latino populations. Raids were stepped up after Trump returned to the White House and pledged to crack down on illegal immigration. As word of the raids spread, demonstrators began to gather in downtown Los Angeles and nearby cities. The Trump administration denounced the protesters as rioters, accused them of attacking ICE officers and other federal agents.
People with big, heavy hammers pounding the concrete and pounding curbs, pounding it, breaking up, and handing these big chunks of concrete to people. And they were taking that concrete, going up on bridges and dropping it into the roof of a car. They were throwing it at our police. They were throwing it at our soldiers that are there. And we got it stopped, and we have them in custody right now.
Trump invoked a law aimed at quelling domestic unrest to mobilize 2,000 members of the California National Guard to intervene. He said in his executive order that the unrest was prohibiting the execution of immigration enforcement and therefore met the definition of a rebellion. About 300 troops had arrived by the 8th of June to protect federal property and personnel. So, what is the National Guard? The National Guard serves as a hybrid entity that operates under both state and federal authority. The National Guard is the only branch of the military that can be deployed both by state governors and the president. Governors almost always control deployments in their states. The role of the National Guard is to protect federal agents, including ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS personnel, as they carry out their duties. The troops will not be conducting their own immigration raids or performing regular policing, which remains the role of the Los Angeles Police Department. The Guard operates like the Army's reserve force. Most of its members do not serve full-time. They generally hold civilian jobs and attend regular training sessions and are called into active service only when needed. It is most often called upon during extreme weather events like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. The law generally prohibits domestic use of federal troops for civilian law enforcement, outside for some exceptions like the Insurrection Act. Typically, a state's force is activated at the request of the governor. Trump circumvented that by invoking a rarely used federal law, arguing that the protests constituted a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. This is reportedly the first time in about 60 years that a president has federalized the National Guard without a state's consent. Last it was activated without the request of the state's governor was in 1965. Trump's move has been condemned by California Governor Gavin Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass, who said they believed local police could have handled the situation. Newsom accused Trump of an illegal act that was putting fuel on this fire and has threatened to sue. Trump invoked a section of the U.S. Code that allows the president to bypass a governor's authority over the National Guard and call those troops into federal service when he considers it necessary to repel an invasion or suppress a rebellion.
Presidents do have this authority. It sort of stems from the commander-in-chief power, but there's actually a specific law, which is Title 10 of the U.S. Code on Armed Services, which says there can be federal deployment of National Guard forces if there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. So, of course, this is in the eye of the beholder, but the notion here would be that these protests, which did not seem to be rebellious in nature or violent, but the idea is that these protests mark a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the United States.
Trump cited Title 10 of the U.S. Code, a federal law that outlines the role of the U.S. Armed Forces in his June 7 order to call members of the California National Guard into federal service. A provision of Title 10, Section 12406, allows the president to deploy National Guard units into federal service. If the U.S. is invaded, there is a rebellion or danger of rebellion, or the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. An 1878 law, the Posse Comitatus Act, generally forbids the U.S. military, including the National Guard, from taking part in civilian law enforcement. Section 12406 does not override that prohibition, but it allows troops to protect federal agents who are carrying out law enforcement activity. National Guard troops cannot arrest protesters, but they could protect U.S. immigration and customs enforcement, who are carrying out arrests.
The danger number one is it gives the federal government, sort of more power, more authority versus the state and local authority. We got this compromise at the constitutional founding, dividing power between local and state government and the federal government, right? And the federal government is supposed to have limited and enumerated powers. The other concern would be the chilling effect, which is that maybe people then don't want to go protest peacefully. Maybe people don't want to demonstrate and express themselves and express displeasure or disapproval, right? That's a fundamental cherished American right, which is the right to protest and exercise First Amendment rights. So I think the larger concern would be if he deploys federal troops anytime that people are protesting his policies and people are getting arrested or hurt, then maybe that has a chilling effect and makes people think twice about doing it again in the future.
The United States has long had more immigrants than any other country. The U.S. is presently home to 1/5 of the world's international migrants. These immigrants come from just about every country in the world. The foreign-born population in the U.S. reached a record 47.8 million in 2023, an increase of 1.6 million from the previous year. This is the largest annual increase in more than 20 years, since 2000. In 1970, the number of immigrants living in the U.S. was about a fifth of what it is today. Immigrants today account for 14.3% of the U.S. population, a roughly threefold increase from 4.7% in 1970. Let's take a look at the key immigration trends and how they have changed over time. Mexico is the top country of birth for U.S. immigrants. Mexicans represent the largest group of migrants. Mexicans represent the largest group of immigrants living in the United States. The Mexico-U.S. route is the largest migration corridor in the world. However, the total number of Mexican immigrants living in the U.S. has been on the decline for more than a decade. The next largest origin groups are from India, China, the Philippines, and El Salvador. In the year 2022, Mexico was the top country of birth for immigrants who arrived in the U.S. with about 150,000 people. Next was India with about 145,000 people, and then China, about 90,000, were the next largest sources of immigrants. Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, and Canada each had about 50,000 to 60,000 new immigrant arrivals. The range of reasons why people move to the U.S. from different parts of the world is diverse. Some are seeking economic opportunities, others are fleeing violence, persecution, or climate disasters. There have also been notable shifts in where these immigrants end up living. Arriving immigrants often settle in historic immigrant gateways in metropolitan areas, such as New York City, Chicago, and Boston. But for more than a decade, a much broader swath of locations in the United States have become hotspots that are home to growing immigrant populations. In 2022, most of the nation's 46.1 million immigrants lived in 4 states: California, 10.4 million, Texas, 5.2 million, Florida, 4.8 million, and New York, 4.5 million. Most immigrants lived in the South, 35%, and West, 33%. Another 21% lived in the Northeast, and 11% of immigrants lived in the Midwest. In 2022, over 30 million immigrants were in the U.S. workforce. Lawful immigrants made up the majority of the immigrant workforce at 22.2 million. In 2023, a total of 31 million immigrants worked in the United States, making up close to 19% of the civilian workforce. In total, the U.S. foreign-born population had a labor force participation rate of nearly 67%. As per the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, versus 62% for the native-born workforce. Immigrants and their children are projected to add about 18 million people of working age between 2015 and 2035. Immigrants contribute to overall economic growth by expanding the labor force and increasing consumer spending. According to an American Immigration Council analysis of U.S. Census Bureau data, immigrants, 48 million of whom live in the United States, generated some $1.6 trillion in economic activity in 2022. They also contributed more than $579 billion in local, state, and federal taxes. And then there are unauthorized immigrants. Undocumented or unauthorized immigrants are those living in the U.S. who entered the country without legal permission or arrived on a non-permanent visa and stayed after it expired. In 2022, about 3 million unauthorized immigrants had these temporary legal protections. Undocumented immigrants' spending power totaled more than $254 billion in 2022, and undocumented households had a combined income of $330 billion, paying nearly $76 billion in taxes. Immigrants work across a wide range of industries and occupations. Compared with those born in the United States, greater shares of immigrants work in service fields, natural resources, construction and maintenance, and production, transportation, and material moving. Each year, the United States also offers a certain number of temporary foreign worker visas, allowing U.S. employers to hire immigrants for temporary jobs. The H-2A and H-1B visas are two of the largest programs. Together, the U.S. government issued more than 576,000 such visas in 2023. U.S. President Donald Trump, during the U.S. election 2024, focused on crimes committed by immigrants in the U.S. illegally as part of his argument for stricter border controls. But the data on the same consistently indicates otherwise. A growing volume of research demonstrates that not only do immigrants commit fewer crimes, but they also do not raise crime rates in the U.S. communities where they settle. In fact, some studies indicate that immigration can lower criminal activity, especially violent crime, in places with inclusive policies and social environments where immigrant populations are well established. Immigrants in the United States have had lower imprisonment rates than the native-born population since 1870. In 2020, immigrants were 60% less likely to be imprisoned than the US-born, according to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Study after study keeps